we're going to get started. I'm Vince McElhinney, Senior Policy Advisor at the Bank Information Center. I'd like to welcome you all to this panel, which is entitled Safeguarding Development Policy Lending. What are the standards? This has been a debate in the making over the last couple of years. The question I think we're going to be wrestling with is whether DPLs and the risks associated with development policy lending in the bank are managed in a way that we're all comfortable with. For those who may not know, development policy lending constitutes budget support for budgets of borrowing countries, and are associated with a number of policy reforms. And so they're meant to encourage policy reforms in a variety of sectors, and in recent years have begun to be used in environmental and natural resource management sectors. On any year, the bank, until recently at least, has been approving between 50 and 60 development policy loans a year. They've constituted as much as 30 or 40% of the overall bank portfolio, so they're a very significant part of the bank's overall business. Civil society organizations have criticized the management of risk of DPLs as a possible loophole in the bank's safeguard regime. In fact, the argument around DPLs and other instruments not necessarily being included in the current safeguard review is one of the central arguments of a policy proposal that the Bank Information Center has submitted to Phase 1 of the safeguard review, which you can find out on the table and look something like this. And so, among the arguments we make are that an adequate and meaningful integrated safeguard framework that we expect the bank to propose at the end of this review process should cover all bank instruments, including development policy loans. So today what you're going to hear are two cases that we feel reflect the types of significant risks that are evident in some development policy loans, in the case of Indonesia and Peru. And then you're going to hear a little bit of an analysis about why, in the context of these risks, it might be difficult for affected persons to bring a complaint to the inspection panel, which is one of the types of accountability and risk mitigation mechanisms that exist for inspection or for investment lending that we will argue doesn't necessarily exist in full for development policy loans. And then finally we'll hear two sets of views about how risk is managed currently at the bank, both by representative of civil society, Hannah Heineken from Global Witness, and we have with us Ed Mounfield from OPCS, both of whom are going to talk about how risk is managed currently in the bank and the trends for going forward in terms of how those risks might be managed in the future. So I'll say a few more words before each panelist is introduced, but we have a distinguished panel before us, and in the order that they're going to present, we have with us Cesar Gamboa, who is the Executive Director of Derecho Ambiente y Recurso Natural, DAR, in Peru. DAR is an organization that works on the types of risks that are associated with deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon and the Amazon basin widely, including energy, logging, and other threats to the rights of indigenous peoples. Cesar is a lawyer. Then we'll have Arif Fianto, who is a representative today for Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Arif is a climate energy campaigner for Greenpeace, and for the last 4 years has worked with Greenpeace fighting dirty power projects, and for the last 2 years working on a campaign related to the Central Java power plant. And Arif is going to be talking about a series of infrastructure DPLs that are associated with those types of investments. Third, we're going to hear from Serge Selwan, who's here today from the inspection panel. Serge is a lawyer from Lebanon and has been working at the inspection panel for 12 years, mainly on projects and programs in Africa and the MENA region, varying from energy and transport to indigenous rights. And finally, as the last panelist, we're going to hear from Ed Mounfield, we're going to hear next from Hannah Heineken, who's here as a representative of Global Witness. Global Witness is an organization that investigates and campaigns to prevent natural resource-related conflict and corruption and associated environmental and human rights abuses. Hannah is part of the DC office and works under the International Forest Policy team. And then finally, we'll have a presentation by Ed Mountfield. Ed is here working with the World Bank. Ed is the Operations Policy and Quality Department Manager and is responsible for operational policy on DPLs and country strategies. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Cesar to help us with the first presentation. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to Big Beans. Please be patient because my English is not so well, and second, I'm a lawyer, and sometimes lawyers are not so clear. Okay. First of all, the idea of, oh, sorry, I have the wrong presentation. Please, you have the English version. I don't know, Christy, do you have the English version? Because it's in Spanish. No? Okay. Sorry.
Just translate it.
I'm going to translate some parts. Sorry. The main idea is try to present the case of Peru, of the DPL, environmental DPL of Peru, because the idea is try to improve this instrument, this tool. No? We are not against this tool, because I think that it's a way to improve in the case of Peru and other countries, it's a tool to improve the environmental management when a country like Peru depends on the extractive industry and continue growing with this model. And obviously, we need to decide a better model of environmental management. No? So the World Bank approved a series of 3 DPLs, environmental DPLs, to improve the environmental and social management between 2008 to 2011. The goals of 3 DPLs were to improve the environmental impact assessment approval proceedings, to improve the natural protected areas management, to reduce the environmental pollution in urban areas, and finally to control the fishery extractive activity. No? And what is the context of this problem? That in this process of Peru that continue growing because depends on the extractive industries especially the benefits of these activities. There were some problems in environmental management in Peru. First of all, there was no coordination between the sectors that approved the environmental impact assessment and the other sectors like natural protected area management system. There was no, the Peru in that moment didn't implement the environmental impact strategic and environmental social assessment, like ASESA. This is an instrument that World Bank promotes. Also, there was a lot of environmental social conflict because the quality of the evaluation of the environmental impact assessment was so poor. There is a huge history of this kind of problems. Maybe you know some of them, like a Dawa case, or currently we have a problem with the mining sector. Well, there is a lot of studies and reports that say that the problem of Peru is about how Peru approved the environmental impact assessment, and I think that the Peruvian government and World Bank decided very well to improve this sector. No? You could see in this chart of the DPL, environmental DPL program, that obviously Peru decided with this DPL the strengthening of the Ministry of Environment for the evaluation and monitoring of environmental impact assessment. No? But the problem of this indicator is it's not a quality indicator, it's a quantity indicator. I mean, the indicator, the target said that that Ministry of Environment select almost 10 projects per year to review the environmental impact assessment. So, if we don't design very well the indicator or the result of this evaluation to improve the environmental management, obviously you have a wrong result, because this is not a real proof if you improve the environmental management in a country like Peru, that we have a lot of problems of not only in an institutional level, but also of the quality of this tool, the environmental impact assessment. No? Also, during this process, there was a lack of transparency because civil society didn't know about that. Also, civil society didn't participate in the process to not only of the design of the tool, also during these 3 years that the 3 environmental DPLs developed. No? We have a problem also. In this chart, you could see that when the World Bank and Peruvian government pick up the indicators, they put indicators like create an institution or create rules or some regulation. But again, this is the same problem. You shouldn't pick up indicators of quantity. We need to pick up to select criteria, indicator of quality. No? So in this chart said that that World Bank and the Peruvian government select this kind of indicators. The Peruvian government didn't assume some commitments, and we couldn't do that. No, for example, in the DPL program said that the Peruvian government assumed the commitment to implement an strategic environmental and social assessment, and until now we didn't have any experience. We don't have any experience of this instrument. So after that, after the execution of these 3 DPLs, we have the same problem. No? Obviously we have a mistrust because the lack of trust of the local population related to the implementation of this kind of environmental impact assessment is growing constantly. For example, in this case, we have problem with mining sector, no? Where the main emblematic project is Conga, that the local population stopped because nobody trusts in the system of environmental impact assessment in Peru that the World Bank select like a result to improve. In the case of Camisea gas project that IPC support by loan to export the gas to other countries, we have the same problem. The system or the goal of the DPL have the challenge to improve the assessment of environmental impact evaluation in the energy sector. Well, this project is stopped right now. No? And finally, Peru 1 year ago created a new institution that is called SENACE that is going to assess the projects of category A, the more complex or that generate environmental and social conflicts, huge impacts. But the problem is that this is the Peruvian government, well, the Congress, when approved this new organism by a law, introduce not a political criteria, no? Because now the Minister of Council or the Council of Ministers could decide what environmental impact assessment or which project is going to the sector or this new organism. So it is a political criteria because one group of ministers decided if the environmental impact assessment, for example, one project, important project, could be evaluated or assessed to the government or technical sector. No? So at the end, but my opinion is that it's a good instrument, the DPLs, that we need to improve that. No? We need to improve this kind of instrument because if you don't have previously an evaluation of the risk of this kind of instruments, you have problems in the design, monitoring of this kind of instrument, and finally in the results. Also, the spirit of the environmental DPL in Peru must be viewed from a critical perspective in order to improve an instrument that can be more effective if it includes environmental and social risk assessment in the design of the design phase, in the monitoring and in the results. No? Clearly, we must move beyond quantity indicators to quality ones to measure results, to monitor them, to ensure that they represent changes, real changes to environmental management of a country. No? So we recommend that the bank must begin to broaden the way in which it evaluates the risk of DPLs to include obviously the people that could be affected by this kind of instruments, and obviously to assure that we could use mechanism of transparency on participation that in these cases obviously we didn't have. No? And obviously the bank must include DPLs in the safeguard review because we consider that they are an important instrument that obviously the current DPL policy not guarantee a better performance for this type of loan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cesar. And I think the theme that what we're trying to suggest is that DPLs are used in complex, obviously complex sectors. It's obviously not a black or a white outcome. In this case, there are complex risks. And the question is whether the current policy is adequate for the best management of those risks. And I think in the case that he suggests, that the conflicts that are ongoing and maybe even getting worse in a country like Peru suggest that efforts to, among other things in this DPL, strengthen environmental management have had very mixed and maybe even some negative results, which suggest risks that may have not been estimated well in advance. So for the second case, I'd like to turn to Arif, who's going to present similar issues related to infrastructure development policy loans in Indonesia.
First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be one of speakers in this panel. So, I would like to show you how World Bank accelerating coal development in Indonesia by its policy. So, Indonesia is one of the most vulnerable and least prepared country to climate change in the world. As an archipelago country, we have 17,000 islands. Oh yeah, yes. We have 17,000 islands. That's why we are very vulnerable to climate change. And the impact including threat to food security, agricultural, coastal, increase in water scarcity and vector-borne disease, and also climate change put development and poverty alleviation at risk. Indonesia, since 2011, Indonesia is the largest thermal coal exporter to the world. So last year, Indonesia coal production is 380 6 million, and 85% of our production being exported to the largest buyer is China, and then India, and then Japan, Korea, and some European countries. And in terms of greenhouse gas emission, we are actually number 3 if we including the deforestation and land fires. But if we excluding this, we are number 14. So yeah, our greenhouse gas emission per capita are growing faster than GDP per capita, and currently coal contribute 40% of our energy mix, and then oil, gas, and renewable energy only contribute 4% of our energy mix by 2012. So to fulfill our energy needs, the government has a project they call the first fast track. So this is actually almost 100% coal power plant project, 10,000 megawatt project, and then the second project it's announced by 2010 by the government. It's coal power plant contributes around 40% in the second fast track program. So this is the overview of World Bank involvement in accelerating the coal expansion in Indonesia. So yeah, as you know that World Bank with infrastructure development policy loans, and then World Bank also provide loan to Indonesia infrastructure guarantee funds, 33 millions, and World Bank has a standby facility for EEGF. And then by World Bank support, Indonesia government create public-private partnership framework to provide industry subsidies, and the IIGF, Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund, guarantee big coal power project in Indonesia. So there are at least 4 big coal power projects in Indonesia. First one is Central Java Coal Power Project. This is will be the Southeast Asia biggest coal power plant if it is built. And then there is a coal railway that connects Puruk Cahu Cangkuang in Central Kalimantan to Batanjung in East Kalimantan. If it is built, it will accelerating coal export to other countries in Asia, especially to India and Vietnam that really that heavily depends on Indonesia coal for its coal power plant. As a transaction advisor, IFC role is very important to enable the government and the consortium to build the mega dirty project, the Central Java Coal Power Plant. And yeah, this is the World Bank Infrastructure Development Policy loan, the DPL covering 2010 to 2011, totaling 850 millions. It's intending at roads, water, and electricity. And for electricity, I think 80% of this, or maybe more than, for coal power plant. And the DPL also support the Government of Indonesia Infrastructure Development Plan, including the fast track power project, the 10,000 megawatt coal power plant. And the DPL also create framework for public-private partnership in Indonesia, and it's including Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund and Indonesia Infrastructure Financing Facility. So Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund guarantee for infrastructure project under the public-private partnership scheme, including fast track power project. This is key to obtaining finance, and World Bank standby facility and additional 30 million for IIGF loan. So yeah, this is 4 big coal power project in Indonesia that guaranteed by IIGF. Central Japa Power Plant, 10,000 megawatt. Kalimantan Puruk Cahu Cangkuang Coal Railway, 1,200 megawatt coal power, mine mode coal power plant in South Sumatra, and 600 in South Sumatra as well. So, as a transaction advisor, IFC has a very important role to make sure that the government build the Central Japa coal power plant. The role is analyze project fundamental. Actually, the original plan from the government for Central Japa power plant is 800 megawatt. But with support from World Bank, IFC, this project is increasing to 2,000 megawatt. Maybe it will be the biggest Southeast Asia coal power plant. And this is the framework for public-private partnership in the power sector in Indonesia. The public-private partnership provides government incentive including value-added tax exemption, import duty exemption, income tax, rate reduction, and yeah, so on and so on. So subsidies to private investor for power project, whether fossil fuel or renewable. So this is the review of potential impact of DPL. So it has inadequate identification of impact. Despite DPL support for energy infrastructure based largely on coal, the review concluded generally policy action supported by the operation do not have significant adverse impact on the environment. So, and the review focused mainly on electricity tariff reform, not guarantees for coal power project. Thus conclude positive. So the question is, potential negative effects include changing the natural landscape, increased emission of greenhouse gas and other pollutant due to increased fossil fuel-based electricity generation capacity. But the developing policy law will address this by strengthening the government EIA capacity. So yeah, actually it's recognized the potential negative effect include changing the natural landscape, the IFC, the World Bank. And if the Indonesia DPL policies and institution enabling big coal project did not qualify, it is difficult to understand when a DPL would be considered by the bank to represent a potential for significant negative impacts. All coal power plants are category A project. If this DPL were subject to safeguard, it would be category A DPL. So actually for the Central Japa coal power plant, there is a very strong local opposition to this IIGF supported project. So around 7,000 community strongly oppose this coal power plant. There are so many things happen on the ground, from the human right violation to the abuses to, and at least there was 7 Batang community was in jail because there's strong opposition to this project. And then in the court they proved to be not doing any wrong things. So they are free without any charge. But they was in jail for 5 months. And the community organized demonstration, maybe every week they show their opposition to this coal power plant. So if it is built, this mega dirty project, it will release around 10 million tons of greenhouse gas emission into the atmosphere per year. Actually, it is bigger than entire Myanmar greenhouse gas emission in 2009. And it will also release mercury, SOx, NOx, and PM 2.5. So even the government or the company claim this is ultra super critical plan, but yeah, this is the data that we had about this project. And also there is a strong local opposition to the Kalimantan Railway. So more than a dozen central Kalimantan organizations oppose the coal railway. So if it is built, the railway will destroy watershed area in Kalimantan. So actually around 5 million people in central Kalimantan and East Kalimantan will lose their water sources because it will destroy Barito River and Mahakam River. And I think one of the most important thing also, if it is built, it will accelerate the coal export from Indonesia to India, Vietnam, and other countries in Asia. So it means that Indonesia exporting climate change as well. And it means that World Bank promoting climate change from Indonesia to another countries. So the conclusion, World Bank Indonesia infrastructure initiated policies and institutions that promote coal development in Indonesia. And I think the most important thing is environmental review did not adequately identify potential DPL negative impacts. And this is my recommendation. So we need to ensure that bank energy direction limit on coal financing is comprehensive and applies to all forms of support, including development policy loan, financial intermediaries, and advisory service. And I think the most important thing is DPL should be subject to environmental and social risk categorization based on robust screening process followed by ESA or category A DPL, like Indonesia. I think that's it from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Arif, and I think you pretty much said it all in terms of offering a great example of another complex and multi-factor risk process that involves DPLs, and I think it's safe to say that few of us really understand, how the risk attributed to the DPLs was actually identified and managed, and that's maybe one of the bigger questions we have for our panel in general. Now, another element to this is what mitigation mechanisms are in fact available for DPLs, and among others, the inspection panel is one. And I'd like to ask Serge to say a little bit about how the jurisdiction of the inspection panel actually works for DPLs.
Thanks, Vince. Let me just pull the presentation out. Now, my presentation is not going to be as interesting as my predecessors, but it's gonna be informative about the opportunities for accountability in the context of DPLs. So the panel's mandate covers when the panel's mandate was written down, it basically referred to bank projects. Complaint against bank projects can be presented at the inspection panel, design, appraisal, and implementation stages. And then that concept of project was later on developed following a correspondence between the general counsel of the bank and the chair of the panel. Back then it was Mr. Broder, who used to be the head of the European Investment Bank, the president of the EIB. And it was in the context of a complaint we received relating to a project in Ethiopia. Later on, this is the first clarification of the inspection panel's resolution, defined the term project to include anything that is incorporated in general in bank practices, so that would include programs and policy lending. Since the DPL policy, the panel received 3 complaints that included DPL operations. That's just something I'm mentioning. I'm putting it in a cloud, and then I'll get back to those. I didn't put much on the process of the inspection panel in this presentation, which now that I heard Arif, I probably should have put a little bit more. But I just want to mention some of the basic criteria. that two affected people by a bank project or program are qualified to send a request for inspection. They have to determine the linkage of they have to at least state the linkage or their perception of the linkage of the project to the harm that is occurring or likely to occur from the bank financed operation. Another criteria that is very important is that the operation should not be closed or over 95% dispersed, and I'll get back to that later on. One final criteria, which is also a very important procedural criteria, is that the information relayed in the request for inspection must have been provided to management prior to the submission of a request, so that management has knowledge of the issues raised prior to the submission of the request for inspection. I have listed here some of the provisions of the DPL policy. I'm not going to go through them, because I'm sure Ed will probably have some words to say on those, but I'm just going to mention that paragraph 6 requires the consultation and participation of key stakeholders be part of the design of the DPL. The bank's role in that respect is to advise the government on doing the consultation and on including participation of key stakeholders. What is key stakeholders and how this consultation are conducted is the borrower's role to do it. The bank has to provide the advice though. Relevant bank documents in the context of the DPL are disclosed. And that brings us to paragraph 29. The program document itself, which is an infrastructure document, what we call the project appraisal document, where all the information about the project are listed. This document is not disclosed unless the borrower consents to the disclosure. So we've had 3 cases, as I mentioned, that related to DPLs. In 2005, we've received a request from indigenous communities in DRC, the Pygmy community, about the impact of a project and a DPL operation on the forestry sector and on their livelihood, basically, and on the ways of living of the indigenous people in DRC. We've received, and you see a lot of dates, and that's probably the most important thing I'm going to say here today is basically about dates. We've received a request in November 19th, 2005. The request related to it, luckily, the request related to the infrastructure and the DPL in this case, which made it that it was very easy for us to process. By the time we registered, it was December 1st. The DPL itself was approved on December 8th and disbursed on December 28th. If it was a single operation without the infrastructure, it would have been 20 days, a 20 days opportunity for the affected people to learn about the DPL, assuming it wasn't disclosed, and to make sure that management has prior knowledge of the issues before they are brought to the panel. Ultimately, we received the management response January 13th. We did our field visit, issued a report, recommended an investigation, and management did the investigation, submitted a report. Management presented some very good actions that were appreciated by the communities. Last week, we had a representative from the Indigenous Peoples Group who raised questions about the follow-up of those actions and the panel's role in the context of follow-up, but that's a separate issue. At the time, those actions were very much appreciated. So basically, what I'm trying to say in the context of the DRC operation, if it hadn't been related, if there wasn't this infrastructure operation related to it, it would have probably been very difficult for the indigenous people to submit a request for inspection within those 20 days, and for us to do ultimately the investigation that we did. I have a map of Congo that you can see on the left. You can see here, this is DRC, the border is in red, but the forest area is the size of Europe. So the impact of that DPL and the infrastructure was, in terms of geography at least, huge. In 2009, we received another operation, another request related to an operation in Yemen. This was a 2-trench operation. The interesting part in this case and the next case is the information that requesters had about this operation. The complaint was mainly about three aspects. One, the consultation. Secondly, the disclosure of the document and its translation to Arabic. The Yemeni requesters didn't speak English. And there was some issues of substance, fuel taxation, and subsidies. The project was approved in 2007. The first tranche disbursement was happened in 2008, 6 months later, about 7 months later actually. We received the request in April 2009. We registered it a week later. We received management's response in May 2009. By the time we did the field visit, management has very well reacted to the issue of disclosure and translated the document and shared it with the requesters. When we were in Yemen, in Sana'a, between June 9th and June 12th, that was the only time that the requesters had actually read the document. And by the end of the process, their concerns, they felt that part of their concerns were actually addressed in the program document. The second tranche was cancelled ultimately. We recommended an investigation. At the time there was a board discussion. Management had presented some actions to address the issues of the requesters. The requesters expressed their satisfaction. By the time these actions were implemented, the panel went back to the board and relayed that the requesters were actually satisfied and the panel's case project was closed. The third project is also interesting. It's a DPL in Poland related to it's called the Third Employment, Entrepreneurship and Human Capital Development Policy Loan. It's a $1,350 million operation. We received the request on June 8th. The requesters hadn't read the program document because it wasn't disclosed according to DPL policy. The project was approved on June 17, 2010, and we finished our work in July 23rd, 2010. It's the last bullet point. But in the meantime, disbursement happened on July 7th, so just about 20 days after approval. And we had shared the document because it had been approved. We shared it with the requesters. We also determined that there was no link. We had, during our due diligence correspondence, we knew the program document, so we had seen the operation. We had correspondence with management to see whether there's a linkage between the operation and harm, and there was no linkage. But we had shared the first time the document with the requesters during this due diligence phase. And that was the first time they read the document. So again, here in this case, the opportunity they had to actually file an informed request if they were actually harmed would have been also 20 days. So that's all I want to say. Thank you. That's our experience with DPL. Thank you.
Thanks, Serge. So, I mean, this is a question that came up in the context of a conversation we've had with the bank, among many, about how we understand risk to be managed. Of course, it's not by any means the only mitigation mechanism, but we wanted to clarify what we thought was, the practice as the bank actually knew it in terms of the role of the panel. And so, with that, I'll turn to the panelists on my right, and I'll ask Hannah Heineken to begin. And again, I mean, I think originally in the panel description we had planned for Hannah to speak first, and I overlooked that, and I'm going to act like it was an intentional move to have her now speak next to last. And I think the point is to actually take into consideration some of the material that we've heard about actual operations, and now put it in the context of two views about how risk is managed and might be managed going forward. And so with that, I'll ask Hannah to begin, and then we'll turn to Ed.
Thanks, Vince. So the question I'm posing here is whether DPLs function under a lower standard, lower in comparison to, for example, investment lending standards, because the question we want to explore one of the key questions is whether DPL should be part of the current safeguard review, which is exclusively right now for investment lending. So this is just a brief outline of what I'm going to discuss. I am going to tease out some of the points that were raised by the other speakers, and I'll end with some recommendations and why DPL should be part of the safeguard review. So in the beginning, Vince mentioned how DPLs constitute about 30% of World Bank lending. You can see from this graph a history of policy-based lending. DPLs, which are currently under OP 8.60, was introduced in 2004, but there were policy-based lending prior to that. So this graph captures that, and the percentage of around 30% is indicated by the line here. I do want to note that the World Bank is saying that the portion of DPLs is declining. So I'll leave it to Ed to elaborate on that. So just briefly on what the DPL policy framework is, I believe I already touched on 8.60. So some of the key policies here I just want to touch on. One, there's a strong reliance on borrower systems. And the bank does look at the appropriateness of using a DPL in the context of a country assistance strategy. And it looks at the borrower's policy and institutional framework, which includes governance, and one of our concerns is management of natural resources, so it looks like that. The commitment and ownership of the DPL, and then its institutional capacity, so its ability to implement and also mitigate potential impacts. Another policy provision that's important is its use of analysis in designing the DPL. And it does explicitly say that the DPL has to draw on relevant analysis that's not only of the banks, but also of other actors. This was raised in all of the examples by the speakers actually, and paragraph 10 and 11 talk about both social. Paragraph 10, I believe, is the social part. 11 is environment, and both say similar things in terms of how the bank should approach impacts. The bank has to assess whether the specific country policies are going to cause significant impacts, and then look at the borrower system to see whether it has the ability to reduce those effects. And finally, it describes in the program document how, if there are gaps in the analysis or shortcomings in the borrower's systems, how that will be addressed. And it's important to note that DPLs, because of this heavy reliance on borrower systems, the bank does look at governance risks quite closely. As you can see from this graph, so CPIA is an assessment tool that the bank uses, and this is capturing one of those looking at the public sector management. And as you can see from the graph on the bottom, so 1 is low, it indicates weak governance, 6 is very strong. And so development policy lending is generally used more for stronger governance countries. That said, it is used in weak governance contexts as well, while the bank states that it is in those contexts, a lot of it has to do with public sector or governance reform. We've found that it does still present a challenge, especially in the natural resource sector. DPLs are being used in the context of weak governance, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. And finally, these are just briefly other policies that are important. The monitoring and evaluation is done principally by the borrower, but the bank oversees that. So first, one of the main reasons we are concerned with DPLs is the inadequate risk assessment. Again, this was touched on by the other speakers, and I just want to elaborate on the DRC example that Serge raised. So in the DRC, this was a loan that was aimed to reform the forest sector. Largely, it was a review of the forest concession system. The DRC is, as you all know, rich in rainforest. There's a huge population that is dependent on the forests. And while the DPL was basically facilitating the industrialization of the forest sector, the assessment stated that there was no significant social or environmental effects. And this is why there was an inspection panel case. And one of the conclusions that the panel made, as quoted here, is that the bank's system, the policy system for determining whether there will be significant effects on the environment and natural resources is flawed. And they also questioned whether DPLs were the appropriate instrument given the governance risks and the environmental and social risks that it presented. And another reason we are concerned, again, is this is Cesar touched on this, that there is limited requirement for consultation. And I quote from the policy here that the bank actually, it states, it advises the borrowing countries to consult with and engage the stakeholders in formulating the development strategies. And the country draws on this in formulating the DPLs. So there's no explicit mandate to consult. The other factor, accountability, Serge already touched on this, so I'm not going to go further into that. But one thing that should be noted is that DPLs can have long-term indirect impacts as a result of it being a policy reform instrument. And so this does make it quite difficult for potentially affected people to bring a case because the harm takes a while to materialize. And lastly, again, just reiterating that the DPLs are of concern because they can have these long-term and far-reaching impacts. And this was something that the recent IEG review of the forest strategy highlighted, that the concession reforms were actually, the forest concession reforms were largely done through DPLs, and that it inhibited rigorous risk assessment and mitigation as a result of using DPLs. And so our recommendations, and again, this is in the primer that's up there, and as well as in the booklet that Vince showed in the beginning. One is that DPLs, it is based on the country assistance strategy, and so the country assistance strategy should be properly assessed for risk, and we recommend using a SASA, a strategic assessment. Robust risk assessment is absolutely necessary, and we find that there's a lot of improvement to be made here, and actually the recent DPL retrospective highlighted this as well, and so we're encouraged by that. Our recommendation is at least to consider these 4 factors, which is the distribution of the costs and benefits of the policy reform, the implementation capacity of the country, which would consider its governance risks, any sub-projects, Category A sub-projects that are associated with the DPL and any existence of environmental and social harm or potential. You can read the others here, but those, I think, as Arif mentioned, the need for especially for high-risk DPLs, we would like to have a very robust environmental and social assessment done on that. And I think categorizing the risk will help to ensure that there's proper scrutiny over these DPLs. So lastly, why should DPLs be part of the safeguard review? One is that we find there has yet to be a thorough review and evaluation of the DPL policy. While I applaud the OPCS for their DPL retrospectives, which are thorough, they're not, in our view, thorough enough. They are still largely a desk-based review. We have found that, for example, the Indonesian infrastructure DPL was not picked up as a prior action that can have a negative impact. The DPL retrospective, let me just back up. DPL retrospectives are done every 3 years, and they were started in 2004, and they are intended to look at the policy and assess how it's performing and how it can be improved. And so the World Bank has been doing this every 3 years. The other reasons we find with the safeguard review, there's a very robust consultation process already established. We think it would be wise to just piggyback on that, and it would be very cost effective. And I think there is a need to have consultations attached to review of the DPL impacts. We also think, and IAG pointed this out, that it's important to ensure coherence in outcomes, and the fact that these different instruments are subject to different safeguards makes this difficult, and we think it's time to start integrating. And there is precedence in other IFIs. The ADB, the Asian Development Bank, and the African Development Bank actually have it all under the same umbrella. So we think it's feasible. And lastly, civil society, during the first phase of the consultations, have been very vocal about including DPLs in the safeguard review. And so we hope the bank will listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. And now, as I suggested, this has been a step in a long conversation that some of us have had with Ed and Manuela and colleagues who've worked on this issue from the bank side. And the reason why we asked Ed to join us today is to offer maybe insight into what the bank is doing from practical kind of operational point of view in terms of both the retrospective and maybe even addressing some of the concerns that have been raised in particular cases. So I'll turn it to you, Ed.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks, Hannah. So I don't have a PowerPoint. I just want to talk. I guess first of all, just to say thanks very much for the invitation to join this discussion about how the bank can strengthen management of environmental and social risks in our policy operations. I think the original title for this talk was going to be something about how we could close the loophole, and I'm very grateful to Vince and Hannah for I think adjusting the title to something that I think is a little bit more neutral and a better basis for a frank discussion, because we don't believe there is a loophole, but I think that we feel there's ample room for discussing how this is working, and I think that's really what this is an opportunity to do. So I guess I want to just convey 3 messages. First is, just to summarize them, first is that I think our values are aligned, not just across instruments, development policy lending and investment project financing, but also I think with your values of tackling poverty, social issues, environmental issues in a sustainable way. So I don't think this is about a loophole, it's about how we can manage concerns that we all share and risks that we're all aware of in the best possible way. I guess second message is that we have a policy framework for managing social and environmental risks in our development policy operations, which works and addresses these concerns, but we recognize there may be room for improving it, and we're very open to having that conversation. And then, I guess third message, we feel that we've made progress in implementing this policy framework, in improving the quality of implementation of this policy framework, but we recognize that mistakes are made. We're keen to learn from those mistakes and to hear from you about those, and we also feel that there is still significant room for improving the way that we implement these policies. So we're not in any way complacent about the fact that there are real risks and that we sometimes make mistakes. So maybe let me just briefly go into those 3 points in a little bit more detail. First of all, we really don't believe that DPOs are a loophole. The bank's just reaffirmed its commitment to an agenda of fighting poverty and inequality in an environmentally and socially sustainable way as part of the new strategy. And I think, no doubt like all of you, I think most people in the World Bank went into development because they were angry about social injustice in the world, and they wanted to be part of a partnership with developing countries to address these issues. And I think that protecting people and the environment are not just your values, but they're core values of the World Bank. And I think that all of our lending and knowledge products are embedded in these values, DPOs just as much as investment projects. So our lending instruments include measures to protect people in the environment in a way that we think is appropriate to the nature of the instrument. That's, as I say, not to say we don't make mistakes, and let's also talk about those, but we think we have a policy framework in place. So let me talk perhaps first about the policy framework. I think actually Hannah gave a very good summary of it, but I'll just recap on that, and then about the practices and the experiences. So first on the policies. So development policy lending, as you know, provides budget support upon completion of a program of policy and institutional reforms. And these reforms aim at helping countries implement good policies to help build their economies and institutions and capacity to support an agenda of fighting poverty and enhancing shared prosperity in a socially and environmentally sustainable manner. And these are country-owned reforms. So they're typically drawn from the national development strategy of the country, which is subject to wide stakeholder consultation in many cases, including with civil society, and the bank plays a role in helping to join that dialogue along with many other development partners to try and improve the quality of the strategy and the implementation of that strategy. And for every reform supported by a DPO, the bank has a requirement set out in OP 860 to determine whether there are significant adverse poverty and social consequences, especially on poor people and vulnerable groups, or significant adverse effects on the country's environment, forests, or natural resources. And when significant effects are found, we summarize the relevant analysis in the program document, and also our assessment of the systems the borrower has in place for reducing these adverse effects and enhancing positive effects. And where we identify there are gaps, we also set out how we think that these can be filled. And we feel that this is an appropriate requirement and an appropriate framework for financing that is policy-based and which doesn't fund specific investments. So as opposed to investment lending, we don't finance a particular set of assets or goods and services through DPLs. We provide general budget deficit financing. So if you like, conceptually what you're doing is funding a very, very small percentage indeed of everything that's in the country's budget. So you could, in a sense, associate the funds with absolutely everything the government does. But really what we're doing when we do development policy financing is that we're supporting policy and institutional actions, and what the environmental and the social framework in OPA 60 is intended to do is to really focus on the impacts of those policy and institutional actions, which we think is the key. So in a way, it's not just that the policies under investment project financing aren't necessarily appropriate where you're not funding specific goods and services in a DPL, but they're also not sufficient, because we feel it's very important we have in-depth analysis of the poverty and social and environmental impacts of the policy and institutional actions that DPOs try to support. So I guess that's the perhaps enough on the policy framework, but let me talk now a little bit about the practice and the findings of the recent DPO retrospective. And I guess, you know, let's acknowledge first of all that development is a risky business. There are always risks in what we do, including the risk that we get things wrong. And we strive to manage those risks rather than necessarily to avoid them. And we also always strive to distill the lessons from the things that go right and the things that go wrong, and try to feed that back in so that we make our instruments and our risk management more effective. And part of that learning comes from the implementation completion report process. For every operation we do a completion report looking at the results achieved, the risks that materialize, and that's independently validated by our independent evaluation group, and is made publicly available along with all the program documents. And we also, as Hannah mentioned, do every 3 years much more in-depth retrospective review of our entire universe of DPOs, and we try to distill lessons from the whole portfolio and to feed that back into subsequent operations. And the last DPO retrospective was conducted in 2012, was based on in-depth discussion with civil society, with governments, with other development partners, and copies of the report are, I think, available outside. And we're very happy to discuss that in detail with any of you. So our goal is to learn from experience and to strive to improve. And I think one point I also want to just note is that there have been, I think, a few suggestions that, from time to time, that DPOs are somehow sort of taking over the World Bank, and that they're kind of edging up to drive out investment lending. And I think this perhaps sort of plays into this loophole narrative that somehow we're doing fewer and fewer real projects, and so not really applying safeguards. And in fact, development policy lending is very cyclical. It goes up during times of economic stress, and it comes back down again when things improve. So clearly there was a spike in development policy lending during the global financial crisis, but development policy lending actually now seems to be coming down, both in nominal dollar terms and as a percentage of total bank lending, which is also declining. So total development policy lending in FY13 was about $9 billion, which is about half of that during the financial crisis, which reached up to 20 billion on average during FY9 and 10. And it's less than in FY11 and 12, when it stood at about 12 billion. And it's also declining as a percentage of total bank lending. So it declined to 29% in FY13, down from 34% in FY12, and from about 40% in the peak of the crisis. So this is something that goes up and goes down, but it's definitely not in sort of long-term ascendancy. And then maybe just let me say a little bit about what we learned in the past retrospective. First, I think that the policy content of DPLs is very different from the policy content of the old structural adjustment loans. I think it's, you know, quite noteworthy that a good few of the examples of problematic DPLs that are in the primer on DPLs that colleagues have prepared are actually structural adjustment loans, or else they're DPLs like the DRC case, which took place 8-9 years ago, when were actually prepared under the old structural adjustment policy framework. Whereas structural adjustment loans often focused on macroeconomic adjustment and privatization, DPOs focus predominantly on very different policy areas. So about 2/3 of the reforms supported over the last 3-year retrospective period are in the area of public financial management, social protection, and human development. And so just looking a little bit at about how we manage social environmental risks in practice. On the social side, we have many prior actions that we do find have potentially negative impacts on groups of poor or vulnerable people. About 8% of our prior actions were found to have that risk, and obviously that was something that went up a little bit during the crisis, when there was a lot of fiscal consolidation and countries were having to cut back on spending programs and manage that. But we feel we're making progress in the way that we do poverty and social impact analysis in the bank. The DPL retrospective looked at the quality of that work and found that it was satisfactory in about 83% of cases in FY12, and this compares with only slightly over half of the cases that we found satisfactory in FY07. So there's room to improve. We're still not where we want to be, which is 100%, but we think we are making progress on this front, and I think this reflects heightened corporate scrutiny, and I think it's notable that DPOs are subject, according to policy, to a much higher level of corporate review than is usually the case for investment projects. All our DPLs have a corporate review at the level of the Regional Operations Committee, which is chaired by a VP, or at the level of the overall Bank Operations Committee, which is chaired by a Managing Director. So we feel we've made some real progress on that front, and we're determined to do better still going forward. And then on the environmental side, in terms of, we talked a bit about the composition of prior actions and the shift away from the old structural adjustment lending to a much more socially focused approach and governance-focused approach under DPLs. And we now find that only 7% of the prior actions in our DPLs even are in the area of environment and natural resources management. But more importantly, perhaps, the review of environmental actions, which was conducted independently by the bank's environment department and not by the people involved in preparing the operations, or by OPCS, found that there were only 14 prior actions out of the total prior actions in this 3-year period of about 2,186 prior actions that were in the area of forestry, so less than 1%. And very, very few prior actions in this last retrospective period were found to have significant adverse environmental impacts in this review conducted by the Environment Department. In some of those cases we found that we were doing adequate due diligence. In other cases we found we weren't, and we're very keen to address this. But I think perhaps just to leave you with one concluding thought, I think, if you're looking for causes for concern, I would say that the real question about DPLs and the environment is not the 1 or 2 cases where we find that DPOs may have done had adverse impacts on the environment that weren't properly managed, although we're very concerned about those cases, but really how we're missing opportunities for DPOs to engage the bank more effectively in strengthening the environmental policies and institutions in developing countries, because it really is only a very small percentage of our DPLs that we're even touching on these important environmental and social issues. So I think let's have a conversation about how we can do a better job of managing these risks, and we're committed, as Hannah said, to establishing a better risk assessment framework for our DPLs. But let's also have a conversation about whether we are whether there's dangers of becoming so obsessed with avoiding all risks, that we actually avoid trying to do good through our DPLs in important areas, including the environment. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. And without further, and we've said a lot and we've hogged up a lot of the oxygen in the room, and I'd like to, in the short time we have left, ask for any questions, if we could open up. Suzanne.
Thanks, Vince. Yeah, thanks. Those were very interesting presentations, and I wanted to just follow up on your invitation to talk about how we can do things
Suzanne, can you
better.
use the mic so people
Oh,
can
there's a
back
mic. That's better. Thanks. Thank you. Is that better? Good. So one of the things you said, Ed, about the small percentage, that really makes these risky projects, I think that we shouldn't play that down really, because in our experience, the power or the impact of DPL is not in its monetary value and not in the size of its percentage in the bank's portfolio. And through policy work, you can have a big impact, a good impact, or a bad one in the long term. And as we saw in the DRC, with this money going into policy reform, you're setting the stage for an entire sector, for millions of hectares of forest and millions of people. So this will have a bigger impact on the forest and its people than whether you took the same money and put it into one single investment, let's say, into one concession. So I think we have to see it from this point of view and not play the impact or the percentage in the portfolio down. And the same is true in the case of Indonesia. And in this regard, I think one of the proposals that were made by Hannah, for example, to improve the risk assessment and the screening was to take this opportunity and include it in the review that the bank is currently conducting on its safeguards. And as far as I understood, you haven't really answered that question, or you haven't really responded to the proposal and said why you think this wouldn't be a good idea. And for example, in the case of Indonesia, clearly the bank is helping Indonesia, locking it into a path of increased emissions and increased climate change and dirty energy for many, many years to come. So realizing that, what can the bank then do, when it's already on its path? I realize it's already on its path, but what can we do now to correct this and go back and do something that's better than?
Well, maybe we could take any other questions or around if there are any others before. I think both of those are directed at Ed. Zach?
Excuse me. Hi, Zach Hurwitz, International Rivers. I agree with Ed. I think there's tremendous potential to do good with DPOs. And maybe one of the problems is that good has really not been realized, that potential's not been realized. If we look at, again, conceptually what DPOs do, the bank is advising creation of policy either in sectors or specific procedures such as EIAs at the government level. And that's, I think, a real chance to add cross-cutting issues that separately we're pushing to be included in safeguards in some ways, but that really have not gotten a lot of attention on behalf of borrowers. So I'm thinking of human rights, I'm thinking of how you incorporate climate change and upstream planning into investment operations in the future. So in the energy sector, for example, tools such as integrated resources planning, if you look at a more broader 10, 20, 30-year perspective of what you're doing in your energy sector in that country. I think that those could be pushed further in DPO loans, with the understanding that hopefully when it gets down to the borrower choosing what projects that are going to be invested, they're actually choosing the right projects based on human rights norms, based on the impacts of climate change on the long-term investment, for example. So I see some synergy with the direction that Jim Kim wants to take, the bank and cross-cutting areas with the potential for DPOs.
Yeah, thank you all for the interesting presentation. I had a couple of questions actually on the Indonesia presentation, and one of them was, as far as I understand, the negative impacts in supporting these coal plants were from a investment guarantee fund. And my question is, was that fund actually part of the policy matrix under the DPL, or is that what the government decided to do with the money? And I think that's an important distinction to make. The other question is, around the same time, I think 2010, 2011, there was also a climate change DPL in Indonesia supported by the World Bank. I don't think you mentioned that. Did that have any positive outcomes? Did it counterbalance at all some of the negative outcomes that you saw from the infrastructure DPLs? Thank you.
Maybe we'll start, I'll ask Ed to lead off, and in addition to the Indonesia question, I'd ask any of our panelists to respond to any of the questions they might want to. But let's start with Ed.
Well, thanks for the questions. I guess on, maybe just to comment on the Indonesia issue, I mean, let me say first of all that I've not been involved directly in the specific operations that are under discussion, and I think the colleagues in the bank that were are not in the room, so I don't think it's necessarily going to be helpful for me to do more than listen and report back to colleagues on the feedback about these operations. But we're very keen to have a conversation, and I think we would welcome the idea of having specific discussions on specific operations where we have the right people in the room to talk about those. But I think it is important to emphasize, first of all, that I fear that maybe the Indonesia infrastructure DPL is being somewhat mischaracterized. We can discuss whether it was a strong operation or not, but it certainly didn't include prior actions that were about coal, and it certainly didn't fund investment in coal. This was a series of operations which were looking to help the Indonesian authorities strengthen the policy environment for infrastructure. And as I think Bill mentioned, there's also been a very active discussion with the Indonesian authorities about strengthening their framework for environmental management as alongside that. So it may be that operation could have been better designed. It may be that we could have done a better job in helping them strengthen their environmental institutions. But I think identifying it as an operation with prior actions that did environmental harm is something that we might want to discuss. I mean, I think the story was also told packaged up with other investments from IFC and also with some technical assistance support for the Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Facility that was done as an investment loan by the bank. But to the extent we're having a conversation about whether we should apply investment lending safeguards to DPLs, it's notable that I think that the two operations that I think colleagues are suggesting are the ones that were associated with coal and with harm were actually the ones prepared under the bank's investment lending safeguard standards, or the IFC's performance standards. So that's worth noting as well. In terms of why would it not be a good idea to include DPOs in the safeguard review? I'm not managing the safeguard review, and I guess I'll leave it to others to consider that proposal. But I think that we feel that the DPL retrospective that we completed did include a thorough assessment of risks, and including environmental and social risks, but also governance risks and public financial management risks, and a range of other risks. We'll be starting, we do these every 3 years as part of a cycle. We are very happy to look in more detail at environmental and social risks in our next retrospective and to have a discussion about these things. But I think that our sense is that a review that's about the safeguard framework for our projects just isn't necessarily the right place to be having a discussion about the way that we manage safeguards or environmental and social risks under another instrument, particularly when we've recently been through an exercise to do it. I guess that's all I'd say on that point. But I think there were very clear recommendations from DPL retrospective, including the proposal that we put in place, as Hannah mentioned, a more systematic approach to identifying risks in our DPLs, including for environmental and social risks. We're very actively working on that with a small team of people, and I think if we divert resources to another diagnosis of the problem, it just reduces the amount of time that we have to work on the solutions that we've already identified in dialogue with civil society and that we want to focus on putting in place as quickly as possible.
Arif, would you?
Okay, actually, I have the briefing from OSCE, so maybe Heike, could you explain?
Just
yeah,
easier for me to speak faster.
Yeah.
The Indonesian Infrastructure Guarantee Fund was a specific part of all 4 of the infrastructure DPLs. It was a part of that program. The bank even says in the program documents for each one of those loans that they designed it, and its implementation and it being set up by the government was a benchmark in those DPLs. It was very specific to those DPLs. It was created to support the PPP framework, which was also central to those DPLs. The IFC, their advisory on it was brought in to support the PPP framework. It did not go through the investment process because it was paid for by a donor fund. And so it was off budget. It doesn't even show up on Indonesia's page by the IFC because it was paid, but they were brought in to support the PPP framework, which was part of the IDPL. And the World Bank's standby facility also didn't go through the investment cycle because it's a standby facility that's brought in to support the PPP framework of the DPL. So we were trying to show the nexus of how this was all part of the DPL, and none of this stuff went through the usual safeguard or performance standard assessments.
I'm happy to look into this, have more of a conversation about it, but I don't think that the Indonesia DPL was funding public-private partnerships. It was putting in place a policy framework to support public-private partnerships. Now, I think it's a reasonable question to ask, did we adequately identify that there are potentially environmental risks associated with greater investment, which is what the Indonesian Infrastructure Facility was looking to do, and did the Indonesian authorities and the infrastructure facility have adequate mechanisms in place for managing the environmental risks, just like other institutions have mechanisms to manage these risks. But I think to suggest that somehow all of the